Hello, everyone. Welcome. It's great to have you here. Thank you so much for attending. I am Rabbi Melissa Hoffman, Executive Director of the Center for Jewish Food Ethics. I use she, her pronouns, and I am a light-skinned, brown, curly-haired person sitting in my office with a beige woven sweater on and bookshelves behind me. This is Faith in Food, Cultivating Hope in the Age of Industrial Agriculture, an interfaith panel sponsored by the Better Food Foundation. This year's panel was organized by the Center for Jewish Food Ethics and the Unitarian Universalist Animal Ministry. We're thrilled to be hosting our fourth annual panel. We had a small hiatus last year, and each year we're humbled and inspired by the robust interest in this program. Faith in Food is designed to help individuals and communities of all backgrounds understand and respond to some of the food system's impacts on people, animals, and the planet. We offer these intercultural and interreligious conversations in part because learning about and from different traditions is a powerful act of connecting. In the face of challenges all people share, we also offer this program with the sincere belief that ancient tradition and spiritual wisdom can influence our understanding for the better and help us light the way forward. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our moderator for today, Dr. Samira Mehta. Samira K. Mehta is the Director of Jewish Studies and an Associate Professor of Women's and Gender Studies at the University of Colorado, Boulder. An expert on interfaith, interracial, and multicultural experiences in America, she is the author of The Racism of People Who Love You, Essays on Mixed Race Belonging. And other than a brief stint as a pescatarian while living in the South, she has been a vegetarian for over 35 years. So welcome and take it away, Samira.
Welcome, everybody. I'm Samira Mehta. As Melissa said, I am an associate professor of women and gender studies and the director of Jewish studies at the University of Colorado, Boulder. I have long, dark, curly hair and purple glasses and a scarf in various shades of pastel, and I'm sitting in front of a bookshelf. This afternoon, we will hear from religious leaders and scholars about how we can come together to work towards more just food systems for animals, people, and the earth. Thank you so much for being here. If you haven't already, feel free to introduce yourselves by typing in the chat box. We would love to know who all is with us today and where you are joining us from. Our panel today will feature leaders from Indigenous, Sikh, and Catholic spaces. The program today will last a total of 90 minutes. I will first moderate a conversation with our guests, followed by a Q&A from you, our audience. You may type your questions in the Q&A box located on the bottom of your Zoom window. We will address a selection of these questions after the panel presentation during the Q&A. So you know, the program will be recorded, and each of the registrants will receive a link to the recording afterwards via email. When you sign out of the program, whether at the end or in the middle, you will be prompted to fill out a short survey. And we encourage you to fill it out, even if you can't stay for the full time. Our organizers greatly appreciate your feedback. We are grateful for the ASL interpreting services of both Maggie and Sharon. Now, let us welcome our panel of experts, each of whom will be introducing themselves.
Well, it's after just started the afternoon here in Oregon, where I am. I'm Reverend Dr. Randy Woodley. Pronouns are he and him. I am Distinguished Professor of Faith and Culture Emeritus. That means I'm an old guy um, at Portland Seminary. I'm a legal descendant of the United Ketua Band of Cherokee Indians in Oklahoma. My wife, who's a member of the Eastern Shoshone tribe, and I are founders and co-sustainers of Elahe Indigenous Center for Earth Justice and Elahe Farm and Seeds. Describing myself, I am just over 68 years old, somewhat large man. I have about just over 6'1", just under 285 pounds. I'm pretty white presenting for a native person. I'm the lightest person in my family. I have a long braid that runs down my back to my waist, hazel green eyes, and I am sitting at my desk in a study surrounded by walls of books, Indian blankets and Indian baskets, and family photos from both mine and my wife's family. I also have a very gray mustache and goatee. Thank you.
I'm Dr. Mary Doak, professor of theology at the University of San Diego, and also have the pleasure of serving as a trustee of the Parliament of the World's Religions. I work in Christian thought, especially Catholic thought, and focus on exploring the relationships between how Christians interpret their faith and how that affects their politics. I'm a small white woman with graying brownish hair and frequently wearing a pair of blue-rimmed reading glasses, also known as cheaters, where I come from. I'm sitting in front of a screen that is largely white with pseudo-Japanese style red flowers on it.
Thank you, Randy and Mary. Hello, I'm Tarunjit Singh Bhutalia, the Executive Director of Religions for Peace USA. I also serve on the Board of Faith and Public Life as Vice Chair. And locally here in Central Ohio, I work with the Interfaith Association of Central Ohio, and I'm also a founding trustee of the Sikh Council for Interfaith Relations. I'm a tall brown man with graying black hair, and I happen to be on the faculty of the Ohio State University. So I'm wearing all colors today, scarlet turban, and the gray is natural, and go Bucks to Atlanta. Thank you.
Thank you all for being here. We have crafted 2 questions for our panel, and each panelist will have 5 minutes to address each question. You are invited throughout the panel to submit your questions in the Q&A box. Please note which panelist you would like to answer your question if it's directed to one panelist in particular. So I am going to start with the first question. What are some foundational values or teachings around food, how we interact with all stages of production and consumption in your tradition? How do these contrast with dominant Western food culture? Randy, would you begin?
Yes, thank you. Well, in our tradition, food is medicine and food is a relative. And so there's a relationship with everything around us. My understanding as I look at the past 3,000 years is the West has imbued itself with Platonic dualism, meaning that it has privileged the ethereal world over the material world. And separated itself from things like animals, plants, etc., and even seen itself as superior to that. We call that anthropocentrism, right? So the West lost its relationship with food. It views nature as mechanistic, objectifying creation, and sees itself as human species above and over nature. That's very different than we understand ourselves as Indigenous people. We feel that we are just a part of everything, not better than, not less than, not above, not below. We are just a part of this, what we call the circle of life. So, and we also understand that we have reciprocity with our food, and basically how we treat the rest of the community of creation very much affects us, and how we treat ourselves affects the rest of the community of creation. We have a Cherokee story that I'll share very quickly. I can't share the whole thing because it would take much longer. But basically, the whole idea is that the animals, there was a time when our people were not appreciating the the way that the animals gave their lives, and they took only the best parts and things like that of like the deer, and so the animals decided they would hold a council and get us back. They would have revenge, and so they decided to go ahead, and they talked among themselves and decided they would put disease on the people. And so all of these animal diseases like chickenpox and smallpox and influenza and different things like that, and the people began to die. And so the people went to the animals and they begged forgiveness, but the animals said, no, we don't forgive you. And all this time, the plants were watching this. And so the plant people began to feel sorry for the humans. And the plants began to come to the humans in their dreams and tell them how to remedy the sickness that the animals put on them. And eventually the people got well. Then all three councils came together, all the animal kingdom, the humans, and the plants, and they decided that how they would have this reciprocity in their relationship. And so that the humans would always be thankful that they would use everything that they harvest and take from an animal. And so as the time went on, and as our saints still believe that there, for every disease, there is a plant that can heal our diseases. So, you know, the unfortunate thing is now that we're not caring that much. We're crowding out the animals. We've lost 2/3 of our wildlife space since 1970. And the food that we're growing is really not healthy for us. And so, like when we have started three different farms, the one we have now, we've always made room for animals as well. They became as important as us, and so we wanted to make sure there was room for them to do what they want to do as well, and we try to not bother each other. So a lot of the food that people are growing now is processed foods. It lacks the nutrients we need. It's shipped from far away. We lose vitamin C and other nutrients. They contain harmful chemicals and they cause disease. In the United States, and you know, the premier Western nation, perhaps, food system pays farmers and chemical companies to poison us and to poison the earth. Laws are created that go against small farmers and favor large industrial, conventional factory farms. And that's, I don't think, how we were created to live with the creation around us. And all of our teachings would tell us that. Thank you.
Taranjeet.
Thank you, Randy, for sharing your thoughts with us. Very, very helpful. I'm sure we will have time to engage with each other as we move on with the conversation. Many of you who are here with us today have probably had langar, or the Sikh community meal, which has become one of the most visible signs, including that at many of the parliament of the world religions. As many of you might know, it's a vegetarian community meal in which everyone sits together, and it's not a feast, it's a simple meal prepared by volunteers, and everyone sits at the same level, and every Sikh worship service ends with this community meal. But the question is, what are the foundational values of the langar? They really are four: compassion, sharing, equality, and service. Four things. Now, how is food viewed within the Sikh religious tradition? Food is clearly, and water and breath is something that we need, right, to survive as human beings. The Sikh scripture goes a step forward and talks about food also being a part of a spiritual life. In fact, in the Sikh scripture, food is referred to in two ways. One is the word in Gurumukhi called rijak, which means divine sustenance. And the second word uses giras, which means nourishment. In essence, the Sikh belief is that God created the entire creation, and the divine also continues to nourish and sustain this creation through breath, water, and food. I will give you an example of a verse from the Sikh scripture, Granth Sahib, in which English translation, the Creator created the creation. The Creator gazes upon it and blesses it with breath and nourishment. So the key here is to find and maintain that healthy balance of the mind and the body, which we consider the human body to be a temple of the divine. So we must also eat as we need to live, but avoid excess and avoid intelligence, overintelligence. Three basic principles that come into play when I will talk about food production are things that Sikhs live by every day is kirt karo, naam japo, vard chako. Kirt karo means to do ethical work and honest labor. Naam japo is to always remember God and be aware that God pervades the entire creation and is everywhere. And the third one is to share your honest earnings with other. The Sikh faith believes in charity, not in charity, but in sharing. Now let me come to food production. Interestingly, in Guru Granth Sahib, the food production is used as an idiom for living a life in which you are trying to meet God. And I'll share with you two examples of that. In many places, the Sikh gurus in the scripture are talking to farmers, like happens in farming. And let me give you this example here. A verse says, by your command, the month of monsoon or the rainy season has come. I have hooked up the plow of truth and I plant the seed of the name in hope of that God, that in God's generosity will bestow a bountiful harvest. This bountiful harvest is talking about the food production, but is also talking about our own heart and how God can come within us and stay within us. And my most favorite one is the second one, in which the founder of Faith, Guru Nanak, uses the metaphor of cultivating the land with one's own hands, just like we would work on our own mind. And he says, English translation, make love the farm, purity the water, truth and contentment the cows and the bulls, humility the plow, consciousness the plow person, and remembrance the preparation of soil, and union with the divine the planting time. In essence, the Sikh tradition, farming of the heart is to hold God within us, and the farming of the field is to cultivate food, but both are somewhat akin to each other. Both of them need to be righteous through honest labor with one's mind attuned to the divine. Only then can there be a bountiful harvest of the heart and of the food. Thank you, Samira.
And Mary.
Sorry, I was having trouble getting the audio turned back on. Thank you very much to my colleagues for their very thoughtful and inspiring interpretations of food and their tradition. I only have a couple of points I'd like to bring out here. One is that deeply rooted in the Christian tradition, especially in Catholicism and the other sacramental forms of Christianity, food is seen as a gift to be shared. Our central ritual, particularly in Catholicism, is the Lord's Supper or Eucharist, which means Thanksgiving, but is more commonly known as communion, where we share blessed bread and wine as a communion, a ritual uniting us to God, to each other, and to all else in God. We experience the divine and our unity with all in the divine through the physical material world, especially through the food that God gives us. Moreover, food is consistently associated in the Bible and in Christian traditions with gratitude and sharing. Food as a gift from God is acknowledged with grace before eating, a very common Christian tradition, and as a gift from God to be shared so that those who have food are commanded to share with those who have no food, whether through famine, unequal distribution, or other reasons of scarcity. We're often reminded of the words of Jesus, "I was hungry and you gave me to eat." But also in feasting, we're given food to celebrate together, to share our joy with one another in sharing our food. The ritual of the Lord's Supper or communion foreshadows what's called the heavenly banquet, Jesus' favorite metaphor for the joyful celebration that is God's final goal. A peaceable kingdom uniting God, humans, and nature in the loving and abundant harmony that is God's intention for all of creation, as portrayed in the Garden of Eden in Genesis, in the New Jerusalem at the end of the Christian Bible, the book of Revelation, and in the prophets, where the wolf lies with the lamb and animals and humans live in peace. That idea of a peaceful harmony between God, humans, and nature has been more recently developed by many Christian leaders, Patriarch Bartholomew for the Orthodox tradition, and especially for my own tradition, Pope Francis, with his idea of integral ecology. Hearts open to communion, communion with God, communion with each other, cannot be closed to anyone or anything that God wills to exist. According to Pope Francis, we're commanded to love God and neighbor, which includes all, especially the most vulnerable and the suffering. And as Pope Francis has been pointing out more recently, the suffering that we are commanded, the poor that we should care for increasingly in our time, is the natural world, which is vulnerable and suffering. And we are commanded to love and care for it. We're fundamentally relational creatures, constituted, made by our relationships with God, with each other, and with the more than human natural world, so that we cannot be indifferent or cruel to any part of God's creation without diminishing our heart's openness to God, to others, and to ourselves. In this case, with integral ecology, we don't pit humans versus animals versus nature. We're commanded to seek the genuine and true good of all because we only flourish together. Now, obviously, our food's production systems currently, particularly industrial agriculture, are quite the opposite of that attitude of open communion with all. We disregard the value of the land, which is heavily polluted, which is cultivated with fossil fuels, which is contributing to climate change, which is losing its fertility, disregard animal suffering. We disregard the crowding, the disease that spread among the animals, and it disregards humans, the workers, the poor who don't have access to nutritious food, and the ill health the system causes to all people in the name of profit. In other words, contemporary industrial farming shows neither the attitudes of sharing, gratitude, and gift towards food, land, and animals, but it is absolutely the inverse relationship to that recommended by Pope Francis as integral ecology and by the Catholic ritual of communion in which we're all united in harmony with each other and God through the physical world. Industrial farming shows exactly how beginning to disregard any one part of creation leads to disregard of all. And as it devalues the land, devalues animals, and devalues humans. Food is integral to our physical well-being, but also to our spiritual well-being. We deepen our communion with God by deepening our communion in loving harmony with all of creation, in gratitude for the physical world that sustains us.
Thank you all so much. I'm going to ask the next question, and we're going to go in the opposite order. So starting with Mary and ending with Randy. In the years ahead, where do you see possibilities for hope and creativity as your community strives to nourish itself while protecting animals, people, and the earth? Mary.
I have, again, just a few points that I'm finding real hope in. First of all, to pick up what I was just saying, the fact that Christian leaders are currently clarifying the intrinsic value of nature, teaching that nature has value in and of itself, and not just for our sake, it is willed by God to exist, is not, I think, what many of us, certainly not what I was taught as a young person, but is increasingly being held up as the mainstream understanding of Christianity. And the young are especially receptive to this. At least that's what I find in my teaching. And frankly, once you see this in the Bible and in the Christian tradition, it becomes rather obvious. It's sort of like, wait, how did we miss the concern for nature, for land and animals? How did it become just about humans? It's so obviously an element throughout the biblical tradition and through Christian lives. And that is, I think, an important aspect of hope, that people are now recognizing that we've lost or truncated an important part of the Christian tradition. But a further development is that Christian leaders and teachers are also increasingly recognizing that we need more than just to correct our ideas, as important as that is. We don't just need a better understanding. We need new ways of living. We need new countercultural spiritualities to creatively live the deeper communion that Francis's argument for integral ecology calls for. And we need to grow in habits of love, gratitude, and respect for all of creation as a counter to the dominant ways of living in Western culture, especially in how we treat food, land, and animals. There are many different groups that are actually doing this. The Green Sisters, one of my favorite, are leading the way in this. Nuns, women who are members of Catholic religious communities, have been developing spiritualities that integrate sustainable relations to land and animals, including food production, with their concern for the poor as they seek to their deeper communion with God. Similarly, Catholic worker houses have long combined traditions of sustainable farming with a countercultural spirituality of living simply and sharing in houses of hospitality with the poor. So we have important resources to grow, to build on as we seek to move forward in not just thinking differently, but in lives that help us live differently. I very much find hope in the fact that it's increasingly possible and easier to opt out of industrial agriculture, to resist the large-scale agriculture, and to support all more sustainable, regenerative alternatives. Vegetarian and vegan food options are increasingly available and in demand. They're delicious, they're healthy, they're no longer penitential as we used to think of vegetarian food, full of flavors and textures. Regenerative, small-scale, humane farms are definitely still in the minority, but increasingly can be found and supported throughout this country so that we can recover positive relationships between land, animals, food producers, and food consumers. While we need government action to incentivize healthy food systems and humane food systems rather than abusive ones, I think ultimately it is these relationships that are growing with small-scale regenerative farms, changing the ways we relate to each other and to the land, that will continue to sustain us as we seek to transform the policies that are hurting us.
Ranjit.
Thank you, Samira. And the middle child is back. Thank you. Friends, I think the reality that we have today is that we have seen an explosion of population in the world in the last century. And that means human needs more space to live. But what that also means is the space to cultivate land has gone down. And that is a real problem that we as humans being faced today, which will become even more acute as we move forward. From the Sikh perspective, the two issues that I think we have to deal with regard to food today are intensive farming and industrial agriculture. And I think, Mary, you already touched upon industrial agriculture. And what I mean by intensive farming is the heavy use of genetically modified seeds, chemical fertilizer, pesticides, farm machinery to make tomatoes that are as big as possible and which don't ripen and are designed not to ripen when they are on the vine, but they ripen when they come to a shop. And when they become red, sometimes the quality or the taste of the food is compromised. That's what I mean intensive farming. Now, in the Sikh tradition, we believe that God created this universe and also creates technology, but we need to be able to use this technology in a way that does not exploit nature. Because God itself, we believe, pervades the entire nature, including each one of us and the animals. As a result, the earth was created by the divine being, and everyone has a right to live, exist, and flourish. As we as human beings don't have a right to destroy the ecosystem in the process. Now, let me come to some specific things. Number one, I think our young adults need to be educated hands-on. Where does food come from? I remember asking my little daughter, now she's obviously grown up, it comes from Kroger. Where does Kroger get the food? From their warehouse. And after that, I don't know. So we've got to educate our children hands-on in terms of where food comes from, have them read, okay, these tomatoes came from Chile, these mangoes came from California. Number two, food and climate change are very closely interrelated. And I'm pleased to see that Green Faith is an organization you all could Google up, which used to be a US-based organization, now has gone international, has now expanded their work to include relationship of food-climate nexus. The third thing that I think we all can agree on is to eat foods that have low negative impacts on the earth. And I think this is where technology can really be of help to us. I was reading something the other day, Samira, that said religion is good for good people and religion is bad for bad people. The same is true with technology, right? Technology can be used for immense benefit, but can also be misused. The fourth part is to look at I know in our country we have looked a lot more at making cheaper and faster food and not as much on the quality of balanced food. And the last 2 points are that we as different religious traditions need to work in our own trenches, but we also need to work with each other in coalitions that are multi-faith and with secular organizations that might be spiritual but not religious, and even those who are simply secular organizations on this issue, which will define the future of human beings. And lastly, we also have to work with civil society and government organizations because they make policies and others. But I would offer a caution. Many government agencies across the world, in some ways, are trying to control and channelize religious leaders for their own benefits. And we see that happening here in our own country. So I would caution when we work with government agencies and faith communities, we not get co-opted by the government organizations. Thank you, Samira.
Thank you. And Randy.
Yes. Thank you both for your answers and responses. I also would like to, I've been watching how hard that our ASL interpreter is working, and remind myself to slow down just a bit for those who are watching by ASL. Forgive me for my rapid speech in the first section. This is largely a systemic problem. And for Indigenous people, this goes back to the founding of the country and the way that the government has operated. It was the goal of the United States and the goal of Christian mission to create a dependency among Indigenous people. And part of that dependency entailed creating poverty among us and separating us from our own traditional foods, and depending on unhealthy commodity food systems. And as a result, Indigenous people in this country, Native Americans, have the worst health in the nation. We lead with just about every chronic disease that we have, including adult onset diabetes, tuberculosis, etc. So food is not just medicine. Food that's processed and chemical laden and not harvested correctly can also be poison. A lot of Indigenous people now, though, are beginning to realize this. It's tied into our decolonizing practices, and we're beginning to what we call decolonize our diets. And that means largely going back to our traditional foods. Incidentally, 65% of the foods in the world come originally from the Americas. And so a lot of the things that people eat, like potatoes and corn, etc., a lot of the peppers, they don't realize that those are actually Native American foods. And most of the food that people call Mexican food is Indigenous food as well. So there's a lot for us to go back to. A lot of Indigenous people not only starting gardens, but farmers co-ops. Harvesting traditional foods is becoming more popular, and we are beginning to be more health conscious as well. So how do we solve this? That's a really good question. We all need more small farms. The UN report on small farms tell us that small regenerative farms can feed the world, increase employment, decrease labor costs through machinery. They produce more nutrient-dense foods, and they're better for the environment. And so we have to create incentives then to move away from large industrial conventional farming, like tax incentives and laws that are more favorable to small farmers. Most of the laws and most of the bills, like the Farm Bill and others, are built for large industrial farms, and they actually are prejudiced against small farmers. We need to create more access in every region of this country to traditional foods for Indigenous people. These are the foods that our bodies need and want, and we need to have access to them. We need to rid the country of large monocrop industrial farms. These farms use 70% of the water supply, and they also waste the most water. If you've ever driven by a field and you see water just shooting up in the air and it's pouring down raining, this is just part of the waste. I've got some other ideas. Well, the large industrial farms also release the most carbon into the atmosphere. we're releasing carbon at a rate higher than we have in the last 66 million years. And so that's harming the planet. So I have some ideas. These may not be, the ideas, but things like transforming beef and pork into luxury food items, like we do lobster and sea scallops, for example. Grow less red meat and spend more time in agroforestry, returning industrial farm pastures and feedlots into regenerative agroforestry, into wilderness, into wetlands, into native prairies, etc. And we will do the earth a lot of good as well. Tax incentives for food purchased through local farmers co-ops, so that we're not shipping food from across the country constantly. Eating more and more local would be another help. And tax incentives for farmers co-ops and local farmers markets. And then outlawing GMOs like most of the countries in Europe have done. So those are just some ideas that I thought of in the sun-systemic realm. Thank you.
Thank you. So we've got a couple of questions in the chat. I would like to start with a question from me, which is just to ask all of you if, as you have listened to each other, you have heard points that strike you as not just synergistic, but surprising in their synergy. I think there are places where you might not be surprised, but anything that really struck you that you maybe didn't know about or are particularly excited about?
I thought that the Catholic perspective shared by Mary was surprisingly, uh, not same, but similar to the Sikh belief. And of course, Randy's view, indigenous religions is something that is interwoven into many, many of religious traditions, even though they might be Eastern or Western religious traditions. I was actually able to connect both with Randy, but Mary's comment did surprise me. And there was somebody in the chat box also made a comment saying that the Sikh speakers' perspectives seem to align a bit with Catholicism. So I thought, I didn't, but that's the reason why we talk with each other, right? Unless we sit together and engage with each other, we wouldn't realize this. So.
I agree. I was surprised that the Sikh perspective on God experiencing the divine in the world was so similar to a Catholic sacramental understanding. And I also agree, because I've been thinking, Randy pointed out, as I think some things I could have said more about our failures, but I was talking about hope and ways forward. How did we develop this horrible disconnected, abusive system when so many of us were and used Christianity to support it? And there's a lot to explore and atone for there, but to pick up on what was just said, I think it is when we talk to each other that we're also reminded of the best insights in our own traditions. Often, when we hear from the other that we've excluded, we recognize that we've also excluded part of our own wisdom. And so that, I think, is also something I'm taking away from this.
I was reminded of the langar I went to at a Gurdwara, and enjoyed the food, of course. I was the sort of person who needed a chair. I couldn't sit on the ground because of my health, but enjoyed it so much. And then the way that you described it, I think that was just fit perfectly with the idea of what was going on that day. But I could feel it, but I didn't have words for it. So thank you.
So in the chat, there are two questions, one of which is explicitly directed to Mary, and I think the other one is also, Mary, intended for you. So I'm going to ask both of them together in hopes that you can then answer both of them together. The first question says, is from Rebecca Allen and says, I understand that the bread and wine offered by Jesus was instead of meat and secretions. Have you looked into the evidence that seems to point to Jesus as a vegetarian or a vegan? Is that of interest to you? So that's the first question. And the second question is, doesn't the interpretation of some Christians of the biblical statement, God gave man dominion over the earth, give, in these Christians' view, license to do as they will when it comes to the treatment of animals, the environment, etc.? So I thought I would hand you both of those together.
Thank you. Great questions. Actually, I think it's highly unlikely that Jesus would have been a strict vegan or vegetarian, both historically and in what we know from the biblical stories. I think rather he probably embodied something like Randy and my ideal diet of meat, very rare, and mostly, he would certainly have eaten mostly vegetarian bread, and wine or wine and water would have been major foodstuffs on a daily basis, supplemented with fish and meat much more rarely. And most views of the Last Supper have it as him celebrating the Seder meal. So I think we could take the bread and wine as representing at least the wine would be one of the cups at the Seder meal, as we'd have to explore that further. But that doesn't mean we shouldn't be vegetarian or vegan. But I think it's unlikely that Jesus was strictly so, but he also would not have been much of a meat eater. And second, then the idea of dominion, yes. And I think Pope Francis writes very well about that as a misinterpretation. That if you look in the context, the rule, the dominion or given, as I sometimes tell my students, is a responsibility of stewardship. Is that says right after, and then they're set in the garden to till and keep it, which is not to do whatever they want with it. But I often tell my students a little bit like the responsibility of a babysitter to guide the children with the parents' authority, but not complete parental authority, but as the parents would want you to care for the child while the parents are gone. Our responsibility in dominion was to care for the world as God would have us care for the world. So I do think that the idea that we could do whatever we want with it has been a terrible Christian misunderstanding that does not fit with the rest of the Jewish Bible that is our Old Testament.
So another question that we have, and this comes from Paul Corrado. How does the Sikh view on food being God compare with the transubstantiation of the Eucharist? So, and Nicole specifies that in transubstantiation, as Mary certainly knows, but for everyone in the audience, transubstantiation in Catholicism, the bread and the wine are not symbols of the body and blood of Christ, but are the actual body and blood of Christ, right? That's a sort of key theological distinction between Catholicism and most forms of Protestantism. So I'm not sure who would be best suited to answer that, but I thought I would toss it out.
I think it is something that Mary and me need to sit down and talk about. One of the dangerous things is to talk about another religious tradition. What I can do is talk maybe about eating meat is something that has been raised, and share that in all this conversation, we as people of faith, each of our traditions is undergirded by compassion, each one of us. That compassion is what we need to remember when we deal with animals. I remember being on a panel, Samira, with a rabbi who said that the Torah tells a Jew a lot of what to do, but not a lot what to believe in. And it was my turn to speak. I said the Sikh scripture tells a Sikh a lot of what to believe in, but not a lot what to do. So in the Sikh scripture, there are verses pro and for meat, and people will choose, whichever leaning that they're on. The historical reality is the last 5 gurus did hunt, and the Sikh code of conduct only lays out one absolute rule, and that is that animals that are slaughtered ritually, whether they are halal or kosher, should not be eaten. And meat that is not kosher or halal, that is, the animal is not killed in a ritualistic manner, can be eaten depending on the personal preference of the Sikh. So it's up to the person if they want to eat that or not. Now, the reality is that technology has advanced much more significantly since many of our religious traditions, including my faith, began, right? There have been mass production restaurant techniques that are there, but it is left as a personal choice to the divine, of the divine, what we should eat. I like one comment that Randy made earlier, that we try to simplify our eating, even when we are eating meat. For example, I'm diabetic. So I have to reduce my consumption of certain vegetables and rice and grain. I originally was moved in the direction of eating more protein, which I have to through meat and others. But now we have many kinds of proteins that we can eat. This is where we make a choice of which protein should one eat that has minimal impact or lesser impact on the environment. So I think it is the issue of compassion towards animals and creation undergirds, I believe, most of our religious traditions, including mine. And I will hand over the hot potato question over to Mary.
Wow, thank you. That was very helpful. Yeah, we would have to sit down and talk more, but I think there's much to explore. Certainly, the Catholic idea of transubstantiation is that God is present as Jesus in that sharing of bread and wine. But it also remains, old language, it retains the accident. It doesn't stop being bread and wine, even if it becomes God for us. So I think it really is about experiencing the reality of God, not merely thinking about God, but experiencing the reality of the divine, identified by, associated in the Catholic tradition with Jesus of Nazareth in his life, his self-sacrificial life, death, and resurrection, as the Spirit of God that unites all of us to God, really, and not just symbolically. So yeah, I think there's a lot to explore there. Obviously, one clear difference would be that we associate it with the specific manifestation of God in the life of Jesus of Nazareth. And I don't think that would be part of other traditions, but there's much to explore about our concepts of the divine and how that is encountered in and through the physical world, which I think also is not completely unlike much of what Randy was saying in different terms about Indigenous attitudes. Perhaps you could say a little more about that, Randy.
And I was actually, the next question I have is for Randy. So if maybe I can give that, and Randy, you can respond both to Mary and to this question. That way we'll have both of those on the table. Randy, could you do a bit more? This is from Deborah Livingston. Randy, could you do a bit more to this being a systems problem? Does framing it as a systems problem, which I think is accurate, does that wording tend to overwhelm or confuse the individual in terms of how they can act to be part of the solution? Does the problem become too large when framed that way? Thoughts? And part of what I like about the question that Mary posed and this question is I think they play really interestingly together in a lot of ways.
Well, because of our advancing technologies, communication technologies primarily, we're all overwhelmed with feeling like we can't do anything because we realize there's so much to do. I think when we look at things from a systems approach, that is how the United States operates. Everything is built into a system. And I'll just add that all these systems were created by people who were basically had bought into the philosophy of Platonic dualism. In other words, they are not seeing the world as whole anymore. They're seeing the world as parts that each can be treated in a different way. And they don't understand the relationship between them. So when we talk about systems, we have to understand how they are interconnected. It definitely means politics. It means getting involved. It means supporting organizations who are lobbying. This is just the reality of what it means today. Now, it doesn't mean that, what I call light bulbs and laundry lines, right? Yes, better light bulbs. Use a laundry line instead of a dryer whenever you can. All of those, simplify your diet. There's a lot of people going to Mediterranean diet and other diets now, and all of those are good. Eating less meat, etc. All of that is very beneficial on a personal level. But remember, personal changes are just a small part of what needs to change. Like maybe 10%. If you look at, for example, water use, for example, I said that large agriculture uses 70% of our water. Industry uses 20%. People in their homes personally only use 10%. So I have a feeling that that's probably somewhat similar in the terms of all the systems. And so what we have to do is and the small things also give us integrity so that we can move on to the next level, if you will. So integrity in my personhood, integrity in my home, integrity in my community, integrity in my organization, and then beyond. And most of us don't feel like we have the opportunity to change the big systems. And this is exactly why, grassroots organizing and those kinds of movements that hit these industries in their pocketbooks are really the only thing that works in the United States. You have to be a part of that dirty money system, and you have to throw a wrench in the gears and somehow stop it if you want to see change. And so I know it's overwhelming. And I've been a community organizer. I've had my life threatened. I've been fired from jobs. I've gone through the whole thing in my lifetime. But yeah, it's a high price to pay, and everybody doesn't have to pay that price. But you have to be a part of this system that we're in order to change the system. And so whatever level that means, maybe that means just being running for a position on your city council or school board, or changing the diet of kids in school. That makes a lot of difference. There's just so many places you can get involved. So I would just encourage people to not be overwhelmed by the system, but find that part that you can play in the system to make the changes that you need to make.
So we have two questions that really get at the question of a plant-based diet, and I'm going to read both of them. One of them really is kind of in line, Randy, with what you were just saying about systems, and it is, what suggestions do you have for government organizations such as this one or these two, and individuals to address the factors above any others which discourage people from choosing a more plant-based diet? So this question is sort of presuming a plant-based diet as a good and asking sort of about a range of ways of encouraging that. The other question is perhaps a bit more rhetorical, and it says, because our climate is in dire straits, would it not be good to educate that where we can, we not use animals for food, as it is exploitative, it elevates above animals, and since less meat is better for the climate, no meat would have to be even better. So we've got both sort of questions about structures, right? Like incentivizing government organizations. And then I think questions about sort of matter of degree, right? Do we want to encourage less meat? Do we want to encourage vegetarianism? Do we want to encourage an entirely plant-based diet? Like, what would the goal actually be around educational campaigns?
If I could jump in real quick,
Mm.
because I'm not going to be very long, and I realize I just talked. But there's only blue zones are those places where we have the majority of centenarians, people who live to be over 100. We only have one blue zone in the United States. That's Loma Linda, California, where the Seventh-day Adventists are hubbed, and that it draws a lot of retired people and etc. But they're a totally plant-based diet, and I've learned a lot by studying their stuff. I'm not looking at their theology. I'm looking at the way that they eat food, and I'm learning a lot. And so I would say that if you want to live long and be selfish, appeal to our own selfishness here, to live longer on this planet and to be longer with our loved ones, then it's probably a good idea to look at people who are living longer and what they're eating.
I would agree with much of, I think, what Randy is saying. However, since I'm an engineer, I did look up the scientific data, and I think there are research studies one way or the other. Both are out there, some that show that yes, longevity of life is longer with a vegan or vegetarian diet. Others say it doesn't make a difference. But be that as it may, we as people of faith are called upon to live out the values of our traditions. I saw this quote at a UCC church once, which has always stuck with me several years ago, that said that we don't take the Bible literally, we take it seriously. And I think it is time we take our scriptures seriously. And what that means is when it comes to eating animals, the fundamental principle that many of us have is that kindness and compassion. And we should, I think, extend that also to animals, and being able to then eat a simple diet in which we can fulfill our own body's needs and not be overindulged or saying, oh, I really need to get this done and I really have to eat this rare steak, which is something I have learned over time to get away. That was something I grew up as a meat and potato kid, growing up in India. And I have gotten to get away from beef because I realized there are other proteins. So I think we have to work on minimizing the impact, and that impact minimization, I agree from Randy, and the question of that does take us down to the path of almost no meat or very minimal consumption of meat, keeping in mind that this can be regulated, right? There is free choice. And so with free choice, I'll turn it over to Mary. Looks like she has something to share.
I'm just agreeing with everything you all are saying. Clearly, a plant-based diet is much better for our health and much better for the planet. But I am also mindful in my own family, for example, my husband's palate has been changing slowly, but he does love his meat. I don't want to be part of the incredible cruelty of our current industrial agricultural system, the way it treats animals, spreads diseases, and is inhumane to the workers. So I tell him, we have a plant-based diet, but if you really, really, really need some meat, we go buy it from a not greenwashed, but a genuinely regenerative, humane local farmer, and we pay a fair amount for it. But why do we make up for that? By eating a lot of the various beans, legumes, and other things that are actually quite cheap in the store. And it's slowly transforming him to enjoy more and more our plant-based food. So I think it can be part of a process. I liked what Randy had to say about systemic change, and the amount of things that need to be done can be overwhelming. But we can begin where we are and start to live, as Taranjit has nicely said, with more compassion and more consistency with our values. And hopefully that will change our hearts so that we can live more and more into a new system.
Samira, if I can interject a question here or raise an issue. I recently have had a friend who's a student at Ohio State who's come to my place. He's purely vegetarian. It's interesting to me that sometimes when I'm making chicken, he wants me to cook a meal with vegetarian chicken for him.
Hmm.
Which is, and I've seen that trend with, what do you all think of? I just can't relate to it, that you still would want to have a veg burger. Anybody have a reaction to that? That I'd be interested to know.
I'm the moderator, but if I might respond here.
Please, thank you.
So I guess I would say I became vegetarian when I was 11. When I was 4, I found out what meat was and I stopped eating it. And then somehow I got it into my head that meat died of old age. And then when I was 11, I found out that wasn't true. So I was 11 when I stopped eating meat. And I'm a vegetarian. I'm not a vegan. So it's not an entirely plant-based diet. I really enjoy things like black bean burgers. I like the ability to participate socially in things like cookouts. I am not personally a huge fan of something like an Impossible Burger because by the time those things were invented, I had lost my taste for them. I also am a little bit worried about processed food, like sort of more intellectually. I'm not sure that they're better for the environment, and I'm not sure that they're better for your body. But that's a me thing. I know a number of people for whom those were game changers. They may or may not be better for the environment, but they are better from certain kinds of animal cruelty standards. And they can be, depending on how often you use them, moderately healthier. They're not always. That's not a consistent true thing. For those people who they were reasonable substitutions, I think those are things that have worked very well. I'm the kind of person when I think like, gee, in my childhood, I liked chicken Parmesan. I'm more likely to go with the eggplant Parmesan, or the New York Times has been pushing a cauliflower one. But I do have friends for whom the option of using the fake meat makes a real difference. And again, is that a net gain? Maybe, maybe not. Different studies, different fake meats, all sorts of different questions there. But if it eases somebody culturally in that direction, I think Mary's comment about cultural shift in her own marriage makes a lot of sense.
Thank you, Samira. We switched the roles of the moderator and the panelist, but I think that comes back, Mary, to the point that you raised. It is a gradual shift that will happen, and maybe using those kinds of processed vegetarian options that sound like meat or taste like meat is a step in the right direction to begin with, but that's not where one needs to stop. One can move further. So thank you, Samira.
We have a question that is on this animal sort of humanitarian question. And the anonymous attendee says, because I have been to slaughterhouses, and when I go to dinner, I empathize with the animal that lost their life. I just don't expect others to cook for me. How does one show compassion to animals if one chooses to cook dairy or meat when they have an option? And I think, I think this is a real question, thinking about the compassion in Sikhism, the compassion in Catholicism, this sense of being part of a whole, which I hear compassion in as well in Indigenous traditions. Like this, I think of this as like a question about squaring those two pieces together.
I could tell my experience as a farmer and an Indigenous person. So we used to, I've raised sheep and goats and cattle and chickens and ducks and rabbits and a lot of different animals, pigs at one point. And, we sort of would, and whenever we took a life, it was done ceremoniously. And we used to say, well, that animal lived a really happy life up until the last 5 seconds. But I can tell you that since I've gotten a little older and we've now have a farm that we only have chickens that we use for eggs, um, I'm very relieved not to have to kill animals anymore. In fact, I wonder how I did it for so long. But I'm very thankful that that's not something that I have to do anymore. And it also has caused me to eat less meat, and the meat that I eat to be very choosy about how it was raised and where it's from and those kinds of things. So yeah, it's just my own personal experience that there's no joy in taking the life of anything. So
And so, I would agree with the sentiments expressed in the question that you raised. It reminds me of another verse from the Sikh scripture with the fifth Guru. It says, and I quote, and remember, this is something we as Sikhs consider to be the word of God. So this is something that we take seriously. It says, be kind to all life, all life. This is more meritorious than bathing at 68 sacred shrines of pilgrimage and giving all kinds of charity. That person upon whom the divine bestows this mercy is a wise person. I think we are all called upon to become these wise person in which we are kind to all life, including animals. So I would have to agree with the sentiments that were just expressed.
I find myself circling back to the first question from Rebecca about whether Jesus was a vegan or a vegetarian, and thinking about the idea that the heavenly banquet where all are united in love and harmony. I think it would be vegetarian, and she's probably very helpfully pointed out that what we have as the central elements are bread and wine, plant-based foods. If animals, and in fact, in those images from the prophets, even the animals at that point will become vegetarian. So the lion will eat straw like an ox, which reminds me also that in taking the Bible seriously but not literally, the stories as portrayed in Genesis, humans were made to be plant-based. They're told in the beginning, God gives them all of the fruit of the trees and the plants and of every living plant to eat, but only with the recognition of human failings. With Noah's Ark, does God say, I give you meat to eat? And it is a concession. And I guess that's kind of how I see it too, back to your question, that eating meat is a concession. It's not the ideal, but we can do it in ways that's respectful of the lives of the animals, that they live a good life up to the last 5 seconds, and use the ways we interact with animals to move us toward a deeper harmony with all life, a deeper kindness and compassion.
So, Mary, we have a question, another Bible-based question. So someone has asked about Iris Veen, sorry, Iris, I didn't mean to butcher your last name there, about the necessity of animal sacrifice to atone for different sins in the Hebrew Bible. Sort of how does a scriptural tradition with animal sacrifice feature into this narrative?
I'm going to have to punt on that one because, first of all, I'm not a Bible scholar per se. I specialize in the Catholic interpretations and contemporary understandings that include the Bible but are limited to it. And that really is a part of Judaism that's never been part of Catholicism. We don't have animal sacrifice, so I think we'll have to leave that one for a Jewish scholar to take up.
And what I'll just sort of briefly note as a Jewish scholar, though not a scholar of the Bible, is that Rabbinic Judaism, which is the form of Judaism that we know in a contemporary context, also does not have temple sacrifice, right? The kind of Judaism that the Jews sort of around you practice is the descendant of roughly 2,000 years ago, what grew up when the temple was destroyed. So, Oh, go ahead.
I did think of another thing. I think in a kind of a history of religions perspective, though, it isn't unimportant to note that even the animal sacrifices were recognition that all of the world is God's and not to be used just however we want. I think there is an element that could be developed there.
So we have about 9 more minutes, and more or less at this moment, not so many other questions. We've got a couple of Bible questions that I think we maybe don't have the chops to do. Neither Mary nor I is really in a position to answer those in great detail. And so I really want to say, with our last few minutes, panelists, do you have questions for each other?
Well, I have one I'd like to throw out because it's something that's been in the back of my mind, and we've kind of skirted around it. I think Randy, especially with systemic change, we haven't specifically or in depth discussed the problem of capitalism, which systemically commodifies things for profit. And it's the engine of our food systems and much else of our whole economy. I would love to hear more from my fellow panelists about how they think of engaging compassionately and with hope for change with the capitalist economic system.
There was a time, maybe 30, 40 years ago, when I had a black beard, I thought I was going to change the world. And today I realize how naive I was. So the only option I have at this time is to change myself and in the process change the world. I don't see how capitalism is so woven into the fabric of our country that the food part is just one small little portion that is there. Yes, but I think the place to begin is be part of the advocacy organizations. But I think the real change is what Randy referred to, is a change begins with us. We are the change we are waiting for. Let us change ourselves, and in that process, we influence the world. That is a perspective. I've been, an activist. I've done a lot of advocacy work, but unless we can all be peacemakers, but at home, if you're going to scream at our children, that doesn't make much sense. So I think the battle has to begin with our own personal choices, and then also get involved with advocacy organizations that already are doing good work that we can amplify with our mouth as well as our purses and pocketbooks.
I'm learning a lot from anarchist friends, and the vision that they sort of have for the world. It almost comes back to being like a small village. And so I know people who are working towards, haven't gotten there yet, and we want to be a part of that, bartering networks among farmers. So one raises milk, the other raises seeds. We raise seeds and vegetables, etc. And you bargain for those kinds of things. That's one way of sort of circumventing the capitalist demands, but it's something that has to develop. And I just need to continue to listen and to participate where I can in those kinds of things. So, but bartering is a little bit of a different form of getting on in the world and getting our needs met. But you're right; it's woven into the fabric of our society in every place we look. And again, this commodification, I would trace back, to me, all the evils of the Western world trace back to Platonic dualism and the 3,000-year-old problem that we've had and developed through empires, which basically tell us this is how we have to live. And there are alternatives to how the capitalistic society tells us we have to live. So to look for those people who are presenting alternatives seems like a wise thing to do.
Randy, it surprises me that we have elected a president who has very little compassion, if any, and yet, claims to be an evangelical Christian. It just, it's flabbergasted me that we're going to have this guy for 4 years, and one of the things that he loves to eat is order McDonald's burgers. And so I don't know how I'm going to get through the next 4 years, but I guess we will.
Yeah, there are a lot of people who call themselves Christians, I think, and we've had our share of them in Indian country as well. A lot of them were genocidal and murderers. So I think people can call themselves whatever. But yeah, I mean, he is simply a symptom of the deeper problem. I'm not surprised at all. Disappointed, but not surprised because the root of our system is corrupt. And so it's going to produce then corruption.
Beautifully said, Randy. Thank you.
I think on that note, we will turn things back over to Rabbi Hoffman and ask her to close us out.
So thank you everyone for being here. Thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you, Samira, for moderating us today. And thank you to our wonderful ASL interpreters, Maggie and Sharon. And finally, thank you to the Better Food Foundation again for sponsoring this webinar, and to all of you for being here. I'm going to close us out with true to the spirit of our conversation, true to the spirit of hope that we hope to leave you with from this conversation, a benediction that was composed by Reverends Alini Silva and John Millspaw. So whether or not you pray or meditate or just sit as part of your own practice, as our time together comes to an end, I invite you to get comfortable, to close your eyes, or let your gaze grow soft, or refocus on the hands of the interpreter, to feel the gravity connecting your body to this earth, and to enter now that space of silence and honesty that is known by many names. May the spirit of all life, name beyond all names, love eternal, show us how to be channels of compassion for all creatures on earth. Today, inspired by these leaders, we seek to begin again in love, hope, and faith. There have been times past that we have seen this world's urgent and powerful afflictions and told ourselves the problems were too big for us to play any role in addressing them. There may have been times when we have seen small hurts, small pains, small abuses, and told ourselves they were too small to bother with. Times when we have focused only on others' problems and refrained from asking others for help with our own troubles, as if we were not ourselves beings of inherent dignity and worth. So today, may we begin again in love, hope, and faith. May the source of every good increase our wisdom and bless our works of mercy and kindness throughout our common home. May we go forth recognizing the interdependence of all and work as individuals and as larger communities to realize a more just and resilient world. May it be so. Shalom, salam, namaste, blessed be. Amen. Thank you again for participating today, and go in peace.